today's date is 24 September 2022, and I am in Nokesville, Virginia at the Tank Farm Open House. And I have the pleasure of sitting down and speaking with Ian Foulkes. Welcome, sir. I appreciate you sitting down and talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Right. I grew up in Dagenham, which is to the east of London. Some of you might have seen the film Made in Dagenham. Well, that's the area where I actually grew up. The school I was at wasn't particularly academic. I was very keen on pursuing a flying career. I found out that the RAF you needed 5 O-levels to get into. The Royal Navy, it was 2 A-levels and 5 O-levels. That was minimum qualification. I didn't want to stay on at my school to get the A-levels. I didn't think I was going to get the required number of O-levels, so that was the Navy and the RAF out of the line. And I went along to a careers fair where the Army were there, and they told me, well, we take people with no qualifications and teach them to fly, but you can't go in directly. So quite determined to try and follow that career path, I joined the Army as what was then called the Junior Entrance System. And this is something that does surprise a lot of Americans, that I went in at 16 years of age. I was a junior apprentice, which was the top tier. There was 4 tiers, if you like, to the junior entrance system. The top were the junior apprentices, then it was the junior leaders, who were obviously primed more towards the infantry, artillery and armour, and below them were the junior soldiers, and these were the guys who had probably left school with no qualifications at all. The youngest you could join for them would have been 15 3/4, so very young, but they would make good solid soldier material. They might not win any awards for academic achievement, but they were definitely good solid soldiers. The 4th tier, which was really, if you like, to one side, were the junior musicians, who went to a place called Kneller Hall, and they were very, very accomplished musicians, and of course were being trained for the military bands, which back then there were far more of them.
What year would this have been?
I went into the Army on the 9th of September 1980, and I served at the Apprentices College until the August of 1982, when I graduated.
What does that mean, the Apprentices College?
Oh, there
That's
were 3.
Completely different than what we would do here in the United States.
Yes, very different. There were 3 colleges: Harrogate, Arborfield and Chepstow. Chepstow is just in the border in Wales and was for the Royal Engineers. Arborfield was the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, and Harrogate, which is where I went, was the Royal Corps of Signals. And these were colleges in that you were taught a trade. You got a very good technical training, you got a very good educational training, and also military training. So that by the time you graduated, you were a fully trained soldier and a fully qualified tradesman in your particular trade. Mine was data telegraphy, so later on I would become very heavily involved in data communications.
Okay. And you said you were 16 when you enlisted?
Yes, I was 16 when I went in, and I was 18 and April, May, June, July, August. So really I was 18 and a half when I went to my first working unit, which was in Germany.
When you go in at 16, are you going into basic training of any type?
Yes, it was the full Army training.
Okay.
The difference was that we were trained around terms which you'd call semesters. But in the British education system, there's 3 terms. So you'd have a spring, a summer and an autumn. And the educational year in Britain starts in September. Why, I don't know. It's just the way they work it.
Right.
So the intakes at all the junior establishments were A, B, and C. So A intake would be in the January, B would be in the May roughly, and C intake will be in September. And that's because when the schools finished, for example, in August, anyone joining would then go into the September intake. If they left in December, you'd be looking at January, and so on. So the intakes were A, B, and C, and then prefixed with your year. So in my case, my intake was ATC.
Okay. Did you have any other members of your family that were military?
My father, who, because I have a father and a stepfather, and I actually regard my stepfather more as a dad, so I call him Dad. My father is dead some time back. He was in the RAF at the beginning of the war, served through. He was a nurse, which back then was very unusual for males to pursue a nursing career, and he'd been a nurse before he joined. Sorry about that. He'd been a nurse before he was drafted into the RAF.
Okay.
My stepfather, or Dad, he was called up in 1943. He'd volunteered for aircrew. He wanted to be a pilot. They sent him away to St Andrews, which is a university in Scotland, a very prestigious one. Then he went into the RAF, started his flying training, which proved that he was acceptable to start the training. And then he was sent to number 1 BFTS in Terrell in Texas to learn to fly. And sadly, he was in the very last intake, and the war ended while he was still going through learning to fly. And apparently this is how tight the treasury is in Great Britain. One of the pilots was up doing a cross-country exercise. He was radioed and told return immediately. So he didn't complete the exercise. He flew back, but apparently he did more rolls, victory loops, and everything else you could think of before landing to get his final bit of fun in.
Right.
So that was a nice thing. So yes, my father and my stepdad both had military service, but no one else in my family.
Okay. What led you to join the military?
Well, as I said, I wanted to be a pilot.
Right.
I also wanted the adventure. I wanted to belong to something worthwhile. Dagenham, as I said, was a very, very rough area at the time. We used to joke that even the rats used to go around in pairs and carry flick knives because it was so hard.
Right.
It wasn't a particularly nice area. It was a typical, again, I do apologise, it wasn't a very nice area. It was a typical inner city school is the way to describe it. Dagenham was built in the 1920s, and its sole purpose was to provide housing for the Foulkes factory. And the Foulkes factory employed, before the Second World War, or at its height, I'm not sure which, it was about 30,000 people. And to give you an idea as to how that's changed, now it's about 800. So total complete change. But our level of education was geared to just that, putting us into Foulkes. But of course Foulkes was getting smaller, so they weren't looking ahead. And I had been told I had a bit more upstairs. I hope that doesn't sound like bragging, but there were there were a lot of very intelligent boys and girls at that school, especially the girls. But only 1 in 10 of us back then. You've got to remember that this is at the end of the 70s when we'd had all that social upheaval in Britain. 1 in 10 of us went on to any kind of further education, whether it be that polytechnics, as they used to be called, colleges or universities. University was an unheard of dream. Very, very few. And to give you an idea, that one boy did actually get bursary to go to university, and the people in his road clubbed together to buy him all the stuff he needed to go. So there was a lot of value, if you like, placed on that. My way out and up was going into the army. As I said, I went to the Army Apprentices College. We all had to go through an education syllabus at Harrogate. We went through our apprenticeships, and you received recognised civilian qualifications for those apprenticeships, and our military training. So I often, when I went back to see some of them at school, and they said, "Oh, what's it like at the Army Apprentices College?" I used to just shrug my shoulders and say, "Yeah, it's just like an orderly college with hand grenades," and just make them laugh. In fact, we weren't, because of our age, we were not allowed to handle hand grenades.
Right.
That sort of thing was polished off later on.
Right. So you made the military career.
Yes.
Was that your intention going in?
Yes, it was. Because again, the pension system back then was very worthwhile. It was something worth paying into. Although, of course, when you're 16, pensions, that's for old people, and you never think one day that's going to be you. But yeah, that was my way out and up, and I don't regret a single minute. There's things that I did that I might change the results of it, but I'd still do the same things again.
Right. What was your specialty? What did you do?
I worked in data communications. Okay. So later on, of course, data became digital, and Britain, I didn't realise it at the time, but we were considerably ahead. What was coming up for us was a thing called ptarmigan, which was the world's first digital communication system, and research for that had started in the 1970s, and by 1985 we'd actually started to deploy this system in Germany, and it was a credibly robust system. It had a lot of what they call redundancy, so it meant that if you took out one particular group of vehicles, it didn't affect the whole system. The whole system could work around it automatically.
Okay. How long was your training for something like that? When were you fully up to speed? And
well, again, the system meant that I went to a working unit as a Class 3 tradesman, but to graduate from Harrogate you had to pass the Class 1 tests.
Okay.
So you were being trained to a Class 1 standard, but the pay system wouldn't recognise that. So when you got to your first working unit, although you trained to first class standard, you received third class pay. But the trade-off on that was that as all junior soldiers, we were being prepared and given the leadership skills to become the future NCOs, senior NCOs, warrant officers, and even officers for the Corps. And I'll give you one example, that in training at Harrogate, my boy Sergeant Major, because we had the actual army rank structure up to the equivalent of a warrant officer first class. You didn't have the pay or the authority, but it was training people up for those kind of roles in reality. This guy joined, he had no qualifications at all when he went to Harrogate, and he retired as a brigadier. That's your equivalent is brigadier general.
Okay.
So yeah, the opportunities were there, definitely.
At some point you would deploy somewhere for the first time, correct? Where would that have been?
Yeah, my first deployment for what we would call it a posting,
okay,
was to Germany. I went to 28 Signal Regiment.
Okay.
Now they were unique because they were part of the NSSG, the North Ag Signal Support Group. The Northern Army Group, as you might be aware, was commanded by the British. You also had all the army groups in Germany came under AFCENT, Allied Forces Central Europe, and you had the Americans in the far south coming up to the British coming down from the north, heavily backed up, of course, by the Germans. That was the bulk of it. How we ended up in the north was an accident of history from the Second World War. In reality, looking at NATO's situation, it would have been better if the Americans had been in the north because of your armoured capability. You have far more armour than we did. And the south of Germany wasn't as good, or my understanding is that it wasn't as good tank country. So being really more defensively based, the hotter area would have been the Northern Army Group, which, with America's fantastic logistical system, your troops would have been better there. You'd have had a much harder fight, but it was more suited to American capability. But it was that accident of history at the end of the Second World War where Monty went up left and Patton went right, and what happened. You know, we Americans and Brits, we had to deal with that situation. So that was the first time when I was part of the NSSG that we came in contact, because the NSSG was meant to represent every country in the Northern Army Group, and technically, because of the American troops in Bremerhaven, they technically should have been part of the Northern Army Group because of their location. Obviously, Bremerhaven was there logistically for supporting American forces, but when we had the big exercises, sometimes the American Signals Battalion would deploy down with us. So the first time really I met American forces, if I remember correctly, would have been on Able Archer 83, which is the one where we came closer to nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis. I won't go into it. I was on the exercise. We heard very little to nothing about what was going on. It just, for us, it was another exercise. The Russians tried to play it, and the left in Europe tried to play, oh, look at the Americans kicking off this exercise. Able Archer was a scheduled exercise. The Russians knew about it. It had gone on for several times. I worked in a secure vehicle, and because of our role, our multinational role, because the NSSG had not just Americans and British, but there was also Dutch, Belgian and German. All fantastic guys, but it was fantastic working with the Americans. They, you know, when they turned up for the exercise, they were absolutely superb. Great people to work with.
So when you're in Germany at this point, or at this time of the Cold War, you're preparing essentially for what the planners thought would be a Russian invasion or a Soviet invasion into West Germany. Correct? Yeah. That's mainly what you were concerned with.
Yes, it was more. Although it would have been Russian-led, it would have been the Warsaw Pact, right. And there's a bit of a difference because there was actually varying levels of capability. For example, I always thought from things that I'd heard and things that I'd read, and being a nosy so I sort of poked my nose into things I should have stayed away from, but we all do things like that. And the East Germans, in my opinion, were by far the most professional of the Warsaw Pact forces. Their ratio of professional to conscript was almost 1-to-1. So a very, very professional army. And when it disbanded, there was one German general, I think it was West German, who said, with the disbanding of the MVA, the National Volks Army, died the last true German army in concept, and I thought they were very good. The Russians are very mercurial. Sometimes they can, you know, as we know from the Second World War, sometimes they could fight like stink. At other times they would just fold at the least thing. So they were quite an unknown quantity. The Poles and Czechoslovakians, again, how much the way that they come under communism would have affected them is a question mark. because certainly when Lech Walesa and this solidarity movement started off in the Gdansk shipyards, the East Germans were told by the Russians to redeploy their forces towards Poland. They were going to do another Hungary, surround them, then invade. And the East Germans, it was the first case where they started to recognise conscientious objectors, because some of the East Germans refused. They said, well, we can understand there's a threat from the West, you've been telling us all this time, but why are we turning around and now facing off against a fellow communist country? So the gaps were starting to show in the Warsaw Pact.
You had an occasion to work with Americans?
On several times. Very, very fond memories of working with them. The biggest exercise I took part on was your Reforger 87, and that was a fantastic time for me, because what happened was with the exercise taking place and the other countries providing the Orange Forces for America, it was the first time the Americans had actually had access into the ptarmigan system, and the vehicle they were accessing it through was mine. And it was just pure chance. On Czech Forge, which was the exercise before then, I'd been seconded to work for an American major, I think his name was Pearson, very, very nice guy. And we came in, set up, and he had local secure communications within 10 minutes for all his headquarters, and within 20 minutes we'd engineered his links in, and that was also with camouflaging our vehicles, getting generators running, etc., etc. So he was a bit surprised when later on I got permission for him to see the detachment, because at this time all the ptarmigan equipment was highly secret. And I got permission for him to have a look around, and he was quite amazed that there was 5 of us running this detachment of 2 vehicles that was providing all this communications power. And it's the power of digital, computers, the way they work. You look at how they've developed over the years, and it was good. It was very, very good fun. I did make a few friends, and I'm still in contact with a couple of them to this day, and I value their friendship. It's something I can say I'm proud to know some Americans, because that sort of makes you a novelty back in the UK. They come out with all this. I won't say the words I'm thinking of, but I'm sure you can imagine when they say America this, America that, and I say, no, that's not true. You're just hearing what someone else has heard from someone else has heard from someone else. It's not like that at all. The first time I brought my wife over, she was afraid because of the reputation about guns, and I said, "Don't worry about that. It's nothing. Don't worry about it." And when she came over, she had a great. We had a great time. We were seeing friends who lived here at the time, and again it was great. She said, "Oh, it wasn't how I expected it." And it's, what do you expect? Come on. So yes, and from Czech Forge, the major in charge of that wrote to my unit saying thank you, and requested that I be deployed for Reforger 87, which is when I met far more Americans. The problem I had was they all wanted to see this new equipment, but I had to ask permission to show equipment to certain people, and even then some items they were not allowed to see, and that was it came as quite a shock, I think, to them. And the other thing I think that surprised them was just how few people were running our detachment, putting up the camouflage nets, laying out cable, and so on. It came as a bit of a shock. I think the commander was General Crosby E. Saint, and if I'm correct, I'm hoping this isn't hearsay, please, because then it gives me a chance to say, "Oh yes, I was involved in that." But he supposedly said to Congress that they'd made a mistake buying the French Rita communication system and they should have bought ptarmigan. But speaking to the chap who was central to making ptarmigan work, he'd started on the research in the 70s, he said, and I thought this was actually very condescending towards the American soldiers, that the American procurement team looking at ptarmigan felt it was too complicated for their soldiers to understand. And certainly from all the Americans I've met, I think that was actually very condescending towards them. I think the Americans could have picked up ptarmigan and really started to give not just our two countries, but starting off getting NATO a modern digital communication systems that we could all have used, which would have made liaison and communications between the varying nations much easier.
I want to touch on a subject. It's a little, no Americans involved in this, but you're the first person I've had the pleasure of speaking to that was in Northern Ireland.
Yes, yeah.
You're real quick and dirty on Northern Ireland. Your involvement with that.
Well, first thing I'd like to say is that it's a very, very misunderstood campaign. Very misunderstood. The second thing is that it's easier to convert 1,000 people by appealing to their prejudices than it is to convert one person by logic. The IRA were very, very adept at propaganda, and they told the American Irish what they wanted to hear to get money out of them. My involvement in Northern Ireland, I'm afraid I can't talk about. It wasn't, don't get the ideas that I was walking around in civilian clothes with pistols. I wasn't. I was involved in an intelligence role, and the easiest place to hide a bunch of soldiers is amongst a bunch of soldiers. So I wore a uniform to work every day. I wasn't sneaking around living in bushes and anything like that. The role of my unit was very important. We had a big impact. One of the things that my unit and its predecessors that eventually became my unit found out was that in the early 70s, the invitation of Colonel Gaddafi, and the invitation came via the East German Stasi, the IRA went to, or sent people to training camps in Libya, where they were trained up alongside the likes of Black September, PLO, and so on. They went back in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and even into the 2000s, but this time they were in the instructors. So they were actually training people. So really this sadly has started to boomerang back onto the American people, because they've been training really what have become today's fundamental terrorists. My understanding is that the two, I don't like to call them humans, who caused the Lockerbie disaster, blowing the Pan Am 747 out of the sky, had actually trained with the IRA. So again, that's something that's hushed up. One of the things that has come out about Afghanistan and Iraq with the IEDs especially is that so many of them conform to IEDs that we faced in the 80s in Ireland, and all your equipment is actually based on British equipment that we developed during the Troubles. To give you my opinion, that when we deployed to Northern Ireland in 1969, we were protecting the Catholics, and I have so much sympathy for them because they had the civil rights movement, and what they wanted was everything we would expect and take for granted in Great Britain. But Northern Ireland was being run by Stormont, and Stormont was staunchly Protestant. And for want of a better description, it was gerrymandered. So the mistake we made was actually deploying the army to protect the Catholics and then not taking control from Westminster. Because when that finally happened, everything that the civil rights have been trying to claim and have been campaigning for, Westminster said this is right. They should have equality of housing. They should have one person, one vote. There shouldn't be any discrimination over jobs, opportunities, the things that we take for granted. And of course, that was one of the reasons why the IRA campaigned so hard about home rule, because horror of horrors, these nasty Brits are actually, these nasty Brits are actually giving our people who we should be defending, or we are meant to be their defenders. It was a very nasty, horrible, dirty war.
You deployed during the Gulf War, correct?
Yes, first Gulf War, Operation Granby.
Okay. Talk about that.
Well, again, on Granby I didn't have any connection with American soldiers. Granby was really the reverse of everything we practiced in Germany. With by then the targeting system was fully in. It was firmly embedded into the divisional and brigade structures. We knew how to get the best out of it from communications point of view. So when we went through, like when your armour went through the tank berm, so did ours. Armour went through, followed by infantry. Some infantry held the breach open, and then a lot of people don't realise that the raw signals were then in and through behind those. Our job was to go forward and provide the through communications as the brigade, the Desert Rats, as they went forward, so our communications vehicles were running ahead. And at the end of the campaign, the Brigadier Cordingley, who was in charge of the Desert Rats, was horrified to find out that out of every 4 vehicles in the Royal Signals, only one of them was armoured, and we'd actually sent soft-skin vehicles ahead of the brigade, so they had the through communications as they went forward.
How long were you there?
I was there for 3 months in the build-up. I was actually taken out of Northern Ireland because I had certain qualifications and skill set that was required, and it was decided that my health wasn't in the best of starting to suffer, so I was posted to Norway, to Headquarters Allied Forces Northern Europe, based in Foulkes, just outside of Oslo. And there I was working cheek by jowl alongside my American counterparts, and it was absolutely fantastic working with them. Needless to say, we all had some very, very good flat parties. I remember being introduced to something by one American chap. He had this barber's chair. He leaned it back on the bar. You laid back in the chair, open mouth. It was 2 shots of something, a bit of soda, you'd call it. You then had to sit up, shake your head, and swallow it. And of course the bubbles were making it get into the blood system that much quicker. So I tried it once and went, this is for wussies, big strong Brit like me. I'll show these Yanks how to drink. I did about 4 of them. Absolutely fine until I got out of the barber's chair, and all of a sudden I could feel myself going numb from the waist upwards, and it was one gibbering idiot in about 30 seconds. So it was great fun, great fun. And one person I will never forget at all was this US Marine gunnery sergeant who worked in the intelligence division, Danny Kane. And Danny, if you get to see this, please do get in contact. He was a fantastic guy, but the film that our boss, this intelligence corps major, had only just seen was Heartbreak Ridge, and he didn't understand a lot of the American nuances. So when Danny Kane came into the section once, he said to Danny, just said to him, "What's this Semper Fi?" Of course, Danny, being Danny, leapt to attention, yelled out at the top of his voice, "Hoorah!" And we thought the boss was going to have a heart attack. He nearly fell out the chair because he was so surprised by that. And yeah, Daddy was a real character, a real character. And I think generally, if you're in the armed forces, you do need to have some character. It's always good to have, say, one outrageous character in a unit, but never two. Because if you have two, they tend to clash. But having just one person does things like Danny Kane did. Hoorah business. It's just, I'm never going to forget that till the day I die. It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Any other occasions where you worked with Americans, side by side Americans?
No, not after that, sadly. Most of my experience was with the Americans when I got to Norway. That was the single largest exposure. I mean, I used to babysit for some of them, and I'm still in contact with a couple. US Navy senior petty officer. I'm not sure what the grade is, but I used to babysit his two children, a boy and a girl, Herbie and Laura. Of course, starting to show my age now, but they're both married with families of their own. And Herbie's actually gone into the US Navy in his own right. Last I heard, he was with Pac Fleet, so he was on the West Coast. So, yeah, it's sort of funny, isn't it, how life moves on. And Laura is now married and she's got children.
How long did you serve?
Total of 19 years. Unfortunately, a lot of things started to catch up with me, and the medical people, we got talking and they said, look, this isn't doing you any good. I was starting to have very violent mood swings. I didn't get violent unless, and I think this is probably typical of those with PTSD, that you can get pushed and pushed and pushed, and 9 times out of 10 you'll just walk away from it, and you might grit your teeth or hit a wall or something, but then there might be that 10th time, and that 10th time, fortunately it hasn't happened to me, but it could lead to very big trouble, because some people don't realise that, well, actually you need to back off and let this person live and let live. I say my opinion these days is treat other people as you'd like to be treated yourself. But I love my term working with the Americans. A friend of mine who was in the Second Gulf War, you probably heard that the British were known as the borrowers. And my friend had managed to inveigle, shall we say, I don't know how he did it, but all this kit, and it's really what we call Gucci kit, nice kit to have. And he got that, and as he was walking away, this American chap said to him, "You guys really are the borrowers, aren't you?" And he turned around and said to him, "You don't actually think you're getting this stuff back, do you?" So it was a nice, everyone laughed, and he went on to it. Sadly, I was out by then, but as I said, I've always got fond memories of my time working with the Americans. I respect them very highly, and I value their friendship. I value America's friendship.
How do you think, looking back on it, that your wartime experience, how does that affected your life? 20 years to think about.
Well, 20 years. It's a long time. I've now been out longer than I was in. But of course, I went in as a boy, really. So it's a case of you can take the boy out of the army, but you can't take the army out of the boy. It has obviously has affected me. I mean, my wife she's really gone through the mill with me. I had a suicide attempt, and it was literally everything just got on top, and I eventually we have a thing in Britain called Combat Stress, which is a charity that helps any ex-service personnel with mental issues, whether it can be alcohol addiction, sometimes drug addiction, but you have to be brought to a certain level, and they were marvellous. And that, and the love and support I had from Linda, the support I had from them, started to help bring me back. And she said I'm much more like the older Ian that she first met and fell in love with than this person who sometimes, for her, it was like walking on eggshells. I ended up being medically retired, so I'm unable to get another job because the pension I get from the civil service, this is a different thing, it specifically says that if I get another job, I lose the pension. So I go from having £6,000 a year to £1,000. My army pension, when I finally receive it, is going to be £5,000 a year. That's for 19 years service, but that's because I didn't do the 22 years. You know, I signed on the line, it happened, live with it. I mean, the fact is that technically in Great Britain, that if I had to rely on those two pensions alone, I'd actually be I would start receiving income support, because I would be considered as below the breadline, as they call it.
That brings us to today. Why are you here at the open house?
Well, a few years ago I was put in contact with this living history group over here, and they were very interested to get their living history representations as accurate as possible, and their specialisation is British Army of the Rhine in the early to mid 80s. Well, that's slap bang in my area. I was also before I left, I was a nuclear, biological and chemical warfare instructor, which in our army isn't a specialised MOS, as you call them, in its own right. It's a course that people are sent away to do, and is a secondary qualification, if you like. I also did weapons instructor, map reading. I did the drill course with the Brigade of Guards, and that is a month of my life I will never get back, and I do begrudge the wooden tops having that. But that, you know, that's another story. It was because of the career path I was trying to move along, was RD, regimental duties. Do I regret it? No. I got the qualifications, the NBC qualification especially, and that helps with them, because NBC, for anyone who was in Germany during the Cold War, especially the latter stages of Cold War, will know how much emphasis was put on nuclear, biological and chemical warfare training. And the Brits version was, well, we used to fight dirty. Well, we do that anyway, it's a soldier thing, but what they meant by that was that you do the minimum decontamination necessary to continue the mission, and worry about doing a full clean-up later on. So I found it interesting seeing the equipment of my American counterparts and comparing it to ours. The materials that you guys were using were actually based on the research that was carried out at Porton Down. So there was commonality there, but again, you know, totally logistic background. America can put far more money towards these things than we can. Like anything else, you adapt, improvise and overcome, as they'd say.
You do. Well, sir, I thank you very much for sitting down and talking to us. Very, very interesting story.
Oh,
so it's different than
you.
what we normally do, so it's a little different perspective.
Yeah, sure.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope you do, and thank you very much for allowing me to say that. And to any of the Americans who might have met me or any of my British counterparts, well, thank you very much, and it'd be nice if we could all get together one day for a few beers.
Absolutely.
But of course you guys are paying because you've got more money.